Good morning to everyone. Today, I would like to present on the topic women trafficking and its judicial approach. First, let us understand what is women trafficking or what is trafficking. The act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving a person by means of coercion, deception for the purpose of exploitation, such as sexual exploitation, slavery, and forced labor, among others, is called as trafficking. Now, in simple terms, what is women trafficking? The act of buying or selling of women or making money from the work they are forced to do, such as sex work, bonded labor, etc., is called women trafficking. Now, as we have understood the definition of trafficking, the next question arises: why are women trafficked? Would anyone like to answer? Why are women trafficked? Yeah, poverty, right? Demand for labor, right? Yeah, thank you. Women are trafficked for the purpose of sexual and economic exploitation, particularly prostitution, pornography, forced labor, including work in commercial agriculture and for domestic work. Arranged marriages are to be sold as brides. These are some of the purposes why women are specifically trafficked. Even children are trafficked, even some percent, very rare percent of male are trafficked. But the women cover a majority of people who are trafficked. These are why specifically women are target as they are easily vulnerable. It has many harsh consequences. Trafficking of women is a huge nightmare for millions of women all over the world who have found themselves held in captive in abusive and exploitative environment. Women are sold and bought like any other business item and are treated with little or no dignity or human decency. It is a problem of crime. Lots and lots of crimes take place when a single woman is trafficked. Next, as you can see in the slide, the very definition of trafficking as given in the UN protocol talks about crimes such as threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, and deception being committed. Trafficking include slavery, forced labor, forced prostitution, child sexual abuse, removal of organs, illegal adoption, etc. Further, many crimes are committed when a trafficked person is prepared to be observed for the above-mentioned purpose. Trafficked women face various permutations of slavery. However, all those forms of slavery have similar characteristics. First, the women are coerced for little or no pay. Second, they are controlled and owned by the cruel employers who mistreated them and dehumanized them as if they are the beast of burden. Such women are always confined in one place. Their freedom of movement is withdrawn from them, and even their communication with their loved ones is completely cut off. Women and girls all over the world are tricked into thinking they will be offered good jobs and education. These women are flown to different countries, even their own countries, and forced to engage in non-ethical activities such as sex work against their own will. The traffickers have well-organized networks and connections which they use to execute their moves while at the same time evading the law. For example, the traffickers operate their business around the world using disguised identities and forged documents to legally move people from one country or another continent. Their victims remain naive and unsuspecting whether they see that all legal procedures are adhered to and their movement is facilitated. However, they experience rude shocks of their lives when they start being treated violently and carelessly when they arrive at their destination. The women are at times locked up in brothels where they are raped, abused, and beaten when they resist. Women traffickers at times take advantage of unprotected and porous borders to move their victims. For instance, the border between Nepal and India is known for smuggling of women and sex slaves into India from Nepal. The border is unprotected, porous, and insecure, hence making the environment conducive for women traffickers to do their trade. These traffickers lure their victims by deceiving them that they will offer them lucrative and well-paying jobs in India, among other opportunities and benefits. In Nepal, it goes as far as promising people into slavery in India. They attract women for marriage and take their attention and luring them into slavery in India. Such women end up in lodges, mines, and other terrible places where they are mercilessly subjected to torturous activities as well as being sexually abused. Now we saw how badly trafficked women are treated. Now, knowing this, a thought comes to our mind: how do people easily get trapped? How can they understand such easy traps? Even we see some people sell their own children. Why? Why does this take place? Anyone? Lack of education. Yeah, right.
Lack of proper law.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Contributors to trafficking. These are the reasons which contribute towards trafficking. The first one is poverty. Asking or answering such questions, staying in a comfortable house, it's easy, right? But what about the condition of the people who are really poor? Poverty is one of the largest contributor to human trafficking. It can drive people to become traffickers. It can drive parents to sell their children and other family members into slavery. People in poverty are targeted by the traffickers who offer them a way to earn money when, in fact, they will actually earn nothing and be treated as slaves. Poverty also plays a large piece in making many of the other root causes of trafficking, driving people to migrate, making education legitimate work difficult to obtain, etc. The second topic is lack of education. It is the second contributor towards trafficking. We are being taught about this concept right now. Why? We understand this topic because we are being taught about it. What about the people who are not educated? Who will teach them? Lack of education can lead to decreased opportunity for work at living wage, and it can also lead to decreased knowledge in their rights. Both outcomes can cause to be a greater vulnerability for human trafficking. In prevention of trafficking, education can also empower children to make changes in their community as they grow older. That will prevent situations and vulnerabilities of which traffickers take advantage. Third, demand for cheap labor or demand for sex. Basic economics tells us that for a market to form, supply and demand need to exist. The demand for cheap labor and commercialized sex lead to opportunities for traffickers to exploit people. Traffickers make a large profit by producing goods and services through cheap or free labor and selling the products or services at a higher price. Commercialized sex is a lucrative market that allows traffickers and pimps to become the only profiter from their victims through an endless cycles of buyer and high prices. Lack of human rights for vulnerable groups. In many countries, groups that are marginalized in the society lack institutionalization and their human rights, which can lead them to be potential victims of trafficking. Traffickers can prey on these marginalized groups because they lack protection of the law enforcement, their families, and even the societies they live in. Also, when countries lack fundamental laws regarding human rights, traffickers feel as though they can get away with what they are doing easily. The next is lack of legitimate economic opportunities. When people lack legitimate economic opportunities, that can also lead to increased vulnerability to human trafficking. Groups that are especially vulnerable in this area are migrants without work permits, those who lack education, those who live in rural areas, and where there are less jobs available, as well as women and certain ethnic groups who may not be able to get jobs due to some discriminations. Traffickers offer seemingly legitimate jobs to people who cannot get them otherwise, only to lure them into forced labor, sex trafficking, bonded labor, etc. Next, social factors and cultural practices. In many countries, culture practices and social factors are a major cause to human trafficking. In some places, bonded labor is seen as acceptable way to pay off debt. In other places, selling children to traffickers is a norm, especially for poor families in rural areas. Some countries, such as Mauritania, still practice antiquated slavery where families are held from generations by the slave masters. There are also instances like Uzbekistan where forced labor is institutionalized. During cotton harvest, all adult and children are expected to work in the cotton fields until the crops are harvested. Cultural and social factors can also lead victims not to speak about being trafficked or who their traffickers are, especially if they come from a group who lack human rights protection. Hence, these are some of the contributors that contribute towards human trafficking, and these need to be reduced, or we can say avoided, to reduce human trafficking. Now, next we'll move on to the topic human rights and human trafficking as a human right issue. Human rights are inalienable right of every human being without which one cannot function as a person having free will and intellect. They are based on fundamental principles of respect for human dignity, equality, and non-discrimination. Trafficking of human being is trade or commercial dealing. As we have read by the definition, this makes trafficking a depraved violation of several human rights. Treating human being as a commodity, which is necessary incident of trafficking, the worst dignity hewed at an individual. A person born with these rights, and these rights cannot be taken away from her or him. First, human rights or women rights are human rights. Equality on the basis of sex is at heart of all instruments on human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, includes the proclamation that all human rights and freedoms are to be enjoyed equally by women and men without any distinction of any kind. Therefore, over last 2 decades, the phrase women's right as human right has been used to explore, assert, redress the gap between stated international commitment to equality for women and actual experience of women. To ensure women enjoy all rights, Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination 1979 was enforced. Women who have been denied the right to education, legal rights are consequently denied the right to control their lives. Unskilled are unable to become economically independent, and such women, as we saw above, are especially vulnerable to trafficking. Now we saw how it is a human right issue, right? Now let us see what are the laws relating to human trafficking. Can anyone say me under which article human trafficking is prohibited? Under which article human trafficking is prohibited?
Vishwanath is telling 14.
No.
Think still he is unbed, it seems. Because of that, he is giving that answer.
Yeah, right. Article 23. And what does Article 14 stand for? Anyone?
right to equality.
Yeah, right. Hope you are clear with both the articles. Thank you for your response. A trafficked victim is a victim of multiplicity of crimes, an extreme form of abuse and violations of human rights. The Constitution of India under Article 23 specifically prohibits trafficking in human beings. Other fundamental rights in the Constitution relevant to trafficking are Article 14 relating to equality before the law, Article 21 pertaining to protection of life, and the directive principles of state policy articulated in the Constitution are also significant. Particularly, Article 39, which categorically states that men and women should have right to an adequate means of livelihood and equal pay for equal work. That men and women should not be forced by economic necessity to enter unsuitable avocation and should be protected against exploitation. At present, legal regime to trafficking of women for commercial sexual exploitation includes the following. As you can see in the slide, the first one is Indian Penal Code 1860. Second one is Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act 1956. And third is ruling of the Supreme Court and High Court. Now let us go in depth about these three topics. The first one is Indian Penal Code 1860. There are at least 20 provisions that are linked to trafficking. Under IPC, a trafficked girl child has been subjected to multitude of violations. The first one are for outraging her modesty, section 354, 354A, B, C, and D may apply. For rape, gang rape, and repeatedly rape, section 375. For being subjected to perverse sexual exploitation, section 377. Now in this table, we can see all the sections under IPC which deals with acts involved in trafficking. Indian Penal Code 1860, section 366 deals with kidnapping, 366A, procuring a minor girl, 366B, importation of a girl below 21, 367, kidnapping, abducting to subject person to give grievous hurt and slavery. 360, 370, buying or disposing person as a slave. 371, habitual dealing in slaves. 372, selling minor for prostitution. 373, buying minor for prostitution. 374, compelling a person to labor. Hence, we can see in the above table, they are all the actions that are involved during trafficking. And these are the sections of the Indian Penal Code 1860 that deals with such crimes. The next one is Immoral Traffic Prevention Act 1956. In 1950, the Government of India ratified the International Convention for Suppression of Immoral Traffic in Persons and the Exploitation of Prostitution. India passed the Suppression of Immoral Traffic in Women and Girls Act 1956. In the table, we can see all the sections under the Act which deals with acts involved in trafficking. Section 3 deals with brothel keeping. Section 4 deals with living on the earnings of prostitution of others. Section 5, procuring, inducing, or taking a person for prostitution. Note the section 6, it will be useful in during the judicial responses. Section 6, detaining person in premises where prostitution is carried on. Section 6(2), presumption of offenses if a person is found with a child in brothel. Section 7, prostitution in the vicinity of public places. And Section 8, seducing or soliciting. Hence, here also in the table, we can see these are all the actions that are involved during trafficking. Hope everyone has noted down Section 6. It will be useful when I'll explain the judicial responses in one of the cases. The next concept is judicial response to issues of trafficking. There have been some principles laid down by the High Court and the Supreme Court which have had a positive impact on the approach of judiciary to case of trafficking. Broadly speaking, These decisions deal with two main concerns: victims' right, and second one is giving appropriate directions to the government to combat trafficking. The first one is victims' right. Many judicial decisions in India have been focused on protection of victims of trafficking. In Prajola versus Union of India, the implementation of a victim protocol was demanded. Prajola versus Union of India. This is a taken up public litigation by Prajwala, which is an anti-trafficking organization that relates to matter touching the unfortunate state of affairs of the care and protection of children, especially girls, through empowered streams of governance, and asked the government to create a victim protection protocol so as to protect the rights of victims of trafficking. Now, as we know, the existing laws do not much protect the welfare of women and children who have been rescued from trafficking and sexual exploitation. Thus, Prajwala invoked Article 32 of the Constitution to file a public interest litigation to force the government to create a protocol for the rehabilitation of women and children who have been victims of trafficking. Traffickers often target women and children living in poverty. As we saw above, they are more vulnerable to exploitation. The Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, as we read in the above slides, we saw that it allowed the authorities to conduct raids on red light districts and arrest women working them. No provisions was made for their rehabilitation and protection. In 1996, authorities began a set of raids on red light areas in Mumbai in an attempt to combat trafficking and sexual exploitation. While such raids are meant to curb trafficking and rescue, rehabilitate, and restore victims, they have largely failed in their objectives due to government's inability to offer any meaningful support and protection to victims rescued from the commercial sexual exploitation. Thus, women rescued return to their sex industry within a year, either voluntarily or by coercion from their former employers. Conditions in women protection homes for women and children are inadequate. Strict rules and regulations make them feel imprisoned again, and there is a severe lack of much needed medical and mental health. There is little or no follow up. The ITPA 1956 contains provision for special courts to be set up by government for summary trials to be directed by the state governments to ensure speedy disposal of trafficking offences. None of these provisions have still been enacted. This makes the trial process in trafficking case needlessly lengthy, resulting in low conviction rates. Hence, in this case, the petitioner called for a victim protection protocol with detailed national guidelines with this regard to pre-rescue, rescue, and post-rescue stages involved in the rehabilitation of women and children for commercial sexual exploitation. The judgment. As you can see in the slide, the Supreme Court ordered the Ministry of Women and Child Development that has taken a policy decision to constitute a committee under the chairmanship of the Secretary of Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, for preparing a comprehensive legislation dealing with the subject of trafficking. It was created to study the various acts, legislations under the purview of different ministries, departments relating to various aspects of trafficking, to consider the gaps in the existing legislation from the point of view of prevention, pre-rescue, rescue, post-rescue, rehabilitation aspects, to strengthen victim protection protocol so as to ensure that victims are treated as victims, not as offenders, because they are forced. Not everyone goes in the prostitution by their own choice. They are forced, or poverty or any such factors that contribute to trafficking force them in that work. Next, to draft a comprehensive legislative framework covering all aspects of trafficking as may be considered necessary, to provide adequate shelter homes for rescued victims, to prepare a comprehensive policy for law enforcing agencies, including lady officers, for handling the victims of trafficking. The second topic is direction to state functionaries to tackle the problem of trafficking. Vishaljeet versus Union of India and others was a landmark decision where Supreme Court took it upon itself to give directions for the protection and rehabilitation of those who has been dedicated as Devdasis by their families or communities for cultural reasons and were currently in prostitution by being trafficked or any other means. Vishaljeet versus Union of India and others. This is a writ petition under Article 32 of the Constitution of India. It was filed by way of public interest litigation seeking issuance of certain directions to look into issues of red light areas and forced prostitution from law enforcement perspective to rescue victims of commercial sexual exploitation and provide them with proper medical aid, shelter, education, and training in various disciplines of life so as to enable them to choose a more dignified way of life and to look into issues pertaining to dedication of young girls as Devdasis and Jogins. The petition brought out the fact that poor parents, on account of acute poverty, were selling their children and young girls, hoping that their children would be engaged only in household duties or manual labors. However, pimps, brokers, keepers either purchase or kidnap them by deceitful means and unjustly and force them into flesh trade. The judgment, the Supreme Court held that this matter is one of the great importance, warranting a comprehensive and searching analysis, requiring a humanistic rather than a pure legalistic approach from different angles. This means the Supreme Court said that this needs a humanistic approach, not a legalistic, that meant to understand the condition of the victims and help them to come out of it. The questions involved cause the questions involved caused considerable anxiety to the court in reaching a satisfactory solution in eradicating such sexual exploitation. The court stated that this malady is not only a social but also socio-economic problem, and therefore the measures to be taken in that regard should be more preventive rather than punitive. This means it said that the measures that should be taken to be more preventive to this cause rather than only punishing them. The Supreme Court examined the constitutional provisions pertaining to right against exploitation and traffic in human beings. As you can see in the slide, considering all the aspects of the matter before it, the Supreme Court issued the following directions inter alia to the state governments and union territories. First, it directed the concerned law enforcing authorities to take appropriate and speedy actions under the existing laws in eradicating prostitution. Second, to take steps in providing educate and rehabilitative homes. Third, to set up a separate advisory committee consisting of relevant government officials, sociologists, criminologists, members of women welfare social organizations to make suggestions for eradicating prostitution and the Devdasi and Jogin tradition, and measures for care, protection, treatment, and development and rehabilitation of victims. Next, similarly, in Gita Kancha Tamang was the state of Maharashtra. This case involves trafficking in child by the applicant, who is stated to be a brothel owner. The judgment shows that in a raid conducted by the police, a minor child, inter alia, has complained that she was detained and ill-treated by the accused after being brought from her native place. She wanted to be rescued, after which, along with her several other girls, has also been rescued with her. The first aspect that the court considered for such a heinous crime is that trafficking in person is prohibited under Article 23 of the Constitution of India. As we read above, Article 23 of the Indian Constitution prohibits trafficking in human beings. It is, therefore, a fundamental right of every Indian citizen not to be trafficked. Such act constitutes the grossest violence of human trafficking and the victims as women or child. She has been convicted inter alia under Section 6 of the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act 1956. As I said you to note down, we saw above it is for detaining a minor girl in brothel which she runs and uses her in commercial sex with persons. The next case is Buddhadev Karmaskar versus State of West Bengal. It was a matter of brutal murder of a sex worker. She was beaten mercilessly by the appellant on the night of September 17, 1999 in Calcutta. She was kicked with fists and legs. Then she was caught by her hair and her head was banged against the floor. She was seen profusely bleeding. The victim was taken to the hospital and found dead on arrival. The incident was witnessed by 4 persons and the post-mortem report found 11 injuries on the body of the victim. The judgment, the Supreme Court held sex workers are also human beings. No one has the right to assault or murder them. As we said, a person becomes a prostitute not because she enjoys it. It is because poverty or trafficking. We need to understand that society must have sympathy towards sex workers and must not look down upon them as they are also entitled to life of dignity in the way Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, as I read above, mentions. Their problems also need to be addressed. If such a woman is granted opportunity to avail some technical or vocational trainings, she would be able to earn her livelihood by such vocational training and skill instead of being forced to sell her body. Hence, Supreme Court of India directed the center and state governments to prepare schemes for giving technical and vocational trainings to sex workers and sexually abused women in all over the country. The scheme should mention in detail who will give the technical and vocational trainings and in what manner they can be rehabilitated and settled by offering them employment. This is like, for instance, if we say, if a technical training for some craft like sewing of garment is provided, then some arrangement should also be made for providing a market for the garments. Otherwise, they will remain unsold or unused, right? And consequently, the woman will not be able to feed herself. Hence, I would like to conclude by saying the horrendous crime of human trafficking is a direct violation of human rights. It can be combated through education, awareness, and implementation of strict laws for human trafficking. Providing full slate of recovery and support services to the victims will help them to recover fast. Continuous effort to protect, rehabilitate, and empower survivors of human trafficking to comprehensive social, medical, and legal services is helpful at a great extent. Combined effort of people like us and government is necessary to address human trafficking or women trafficking. India needs to ensure that major conventions, especially UNTOC, as you can see in the slide, and protocols are ratified for a more uniform system of anti-trafficking frameworks for tackling the cross-border trafficking. India needs to cooperate with its neighbor, especially with Nepal and Bangladesh, to tackle cross-border trafficking. Although some measures still exist. These need to be formalized in law and policy and operationalized through training programs for different stakeholders. Cross-border trafficking in the region cannot be tackled without India's commitment matched by law, policy, and nation. At last, I'd like to end by quoting, "Changes will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the change that we seek." Thank you.
So the change should be from those who are practicing such kind of crime. You and me, what we can do is we could sensitize society about that. That's it, isn't it?
Yes, sir.